I now invite Martha Nixon. Martha, yes, thank you. Martha's one of our longtime members and has given so much of her time and talents to our church. So we ask her to light that chalice and lead us in the affirmation of covenant, which is in your order of service.
I light this chalice with these words. Open our eyes to see what is beautiful. Open our minds to learn what is true. Open our hearts to love one another. Please join me in the affirmation of covenant, which you will find printed in your order of service, saying, Love is the doctrine of this church.
The quest for truth is its sacrament, and the service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other. I remember about 25 years ago, I took a trip to Thailand to visit a pen pal I've long since lost touch with. We visited the National Palace in Bangkok, which has a Buddhist temple in it, as a European castle would have a chapel in it. Seated on the floor with 20 or so other tourists on the English language tour, I listened to our guide, a native of the Netherlands, tell us about the role of this temple and of Buddhism in the life of Thailand's royal family. Early in her presentation, she felt the need to explain what Buddhism was. A dangerous thing to do in front of a vacationing Unitarian minister. She said Buddhism is not so much a religion as a way of life. I couldn't let that go by. But religion is a way of life. Every religion has practices for living your daily life, I said. That caught her by surprise, but she recovered well, finding a way to respond that I felt was not just polite, but generous. Yes, that's true. And she hesitated a moment to see if she could rephrase in a way to help me understand what she meant. And at that moment, a young man from Germany beside me turned to me and said, "She means that in Buddhism there's no God." But all around us, on the walls of this temple, were figures not just of Buddhas, but of Hindu gods, who are part of Buddhist religious thought. "What do you mean in Buddhism there's no God?" I managed not to say. Instead, I said, "You don't need a God to have a religion." The young German made a face and turned away. The tour guide pressed ahead with her planned presentation. I kept my mouth shut for the rest of the tour. It's better to have something positive to say. As you know, Unitarian Universalism is a faith without a creed. There's no statement of belief that we ask you to sign on to. Peter Morales, when he was president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, used to favor the phrase, faith beyond belief. Instead, we have covenants, of which you've heard tell. Agreements about how we will be together and treat each other. That's why we talk about love being at the center of our faith, and while in any gathering we are a diverse bunch, we do find in each congregation certain values we hold in common and try to live into. That's why in our latest common description of our faith, enshrined in the UUA bylaws as Article 2, we depict a cluster of values centered on love, justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity. And that's why at this church we say each Sunday, love is our doctrine and service is our prayer. This month I'm going to be talking about spiritual practices, concrete things that we do to help us live our faith. Today I'll explore this thing we are in the middle of doing right now. Why we do it, why it looks the way it does in our tradition, how to engage it, and what we hope to get from it. Next week I'll take up private or individual spiritual practice. How do you start and end your day? How do you sustain and steady yourself in times of trouble or challenge? How do you remind yourself of your best self and the values you want to live into? And then on the last Sunday of this month, I'll talk about how we think about our spiritual practice theologically, which turns out to be a common thread running through all spiritual traditions, known to scholars as the mystical element of religion. It emerged in our visioning process in February here at the church that a number of us experienced discomfort around worship. For some, it's a struggle to wrap their minds around why we even call this Sunday morning collective spiritual practice by the name worship. The idea of worship that prevails in American society is about human submission to a supernatural being that not all of us here believe in. With all our acknowledgement of diversity and commitment to inclusion, we surely don't mean to be forcing that idea on ourselves, do we? No, we don't. Really, the prevailing idea of worship is at odds with the word's primary and etymological meaning. Its first occurrence in the 12th century was as a sort of courtesy title used to address nobles or worthies. Your Excellency, your worship, that sort of thing. By the 13th century, its use had broadened. To be engaged in worshipful service meant to have honorable work. It's not a person, but the work that is worthy. So it's broadened from a person, your worship, to worshipful service. As a verb, it meant to acknowledge the worth of someone or something. We still have that meaning, now often implying a perhaps excessive or misplaced admiration. Oh, she really worships him. Or he, her, or they, them. But the most common meaning today is to go to a religious ceremony. All of these meanings, I point out, are separable from the idea of human submission to a supernatural being. Every one of those. So why do so many Unitarian Universalists still use that word? It's just that worship is a distinct religious art form for which we really don't have another word. The best that Unitarian Universalists have been able to do is to use the euphemism Sunday service, which simply elides the word worship. It is a dodge, a finesse, leaning into denial, which is no way to live your life. It's much better to collectively own up, to have some positive way to name what we're doing here on a Sunday morning. My friends, this is a collective spiritual practice that we gather and do for our collective liberation. This is a collective spiritual practice that we gather and do for our collective liberation. Having a positive description helps us know how to prepare the service and how to engage with it. Now, intellectual discomfort is only part of what we heard in February. Another kind of discomfort, for those of us who grew up in a very different religious tradition, has to do with the way some of our inherited Sunday morning practices resonate in our bodies and with memories of our childhood religion. For some, there is a kind of cognitive dissonance between cherished childhood memories and our adult spiritual ground. For others, there is the pain of childhood religious trauma that interrupts our adult capacity to engage some religious activities or ideas and still feel safe and whole. That's another thing entirely. We on the worship arts team are aware of all these forms of discomfort and are committed to developing good and helpful and healing ways to address them. We hope to spare everyone unwanted discomfort without losing an experience of collective spiritual practice that truly does equip, encourage, and move us toward collective liberation and spiritual well-being. Now, when I saw in your search committee's description of the church that you call the team charged with making this collective spiritual practice happen every Sunday the worship arts team, I thought, wow, that's cool. It conveyed to me that somebody here understood worship and its elements as an art form. Holy cow. And it struck me that the name Worship Arts Team helps put a helpful distance between our Sunday collective spiritual practice and those conventional ideas of worship. I thought that was a pretty smart move. So, what are worship arts? Well, you're holding a list of them. And I know no better and more concise way to talk about them than to walk you through the order of service. And along the way, I'll digress once or twice into aspects of our tradition and heritage that the order of service subtly refers to, so subtly that you might not be aware of it. Those references offer a context for our spiritual practice, our collective spiritual practice, and why it looks the way it does. One more observation before we dive in. Because we left off long ago privileging any particular sacred literature as authoritative for us, looking instead to conscience and reason to interpret and find meaning in our lived experience. Preaching in our tradition is thematic. We do not follow a lectionary, although if you want one, King's Chapel in Boston, when it changed from Anglican to Unitarian in 1787, revised its Book of Common Prayer to remove all references to the Trinity. And there's a lectionary in the back of it, available at the UUA bookstore. Instead, we work from themes suggested by local needs, current events, or whatever is the current content of Article 2. In addition, since we are an association of independent congregations, each congregation will have developed its own traditions and liturgical year, that is, themes that are repeated annually. Water communion, blessing the animals, illuminations, and flower communion are examples of what I mean. Okay, so now let's dive in. You see, the first element in your order of service is the call to gather. Immediately, we have a subtle reference to our heritage that needs some unpacking in an historical digression. Aren't you lucky? When the Reformation came to England, it was political. Henry VIII wanted a divorce, so he took over the church to get it. The Church of England was conceived as a national church. There is a Book of Common Prayer so that the form of worship would be uniform throughout the land. That was the idea. Didn't matter what you believed, it mattered you did the same thing in every church every Sunday. During the English Civil Wars of the 1640s, the illusion of a national church was shattered, and ever after, the government tried to impose order on England's diversity of churches. The Church of England had its 39 articles. For the rest, the Westminster Confession was devised as a kind of common ground. Not everyone was willing to stand on it. Churches in the Massachusetts Bay Colony insisted that they did not separate themselves from the Church of England, only from its corruptions. Their Cambridge platform, a response to the Westminster Confession, laid out their system of independent, self-governing congregations, which we inherit. The only connection between their churches were voluntary consociations for counsel and advice. Back in England, a faction called independent churches, who jolly well did separate themselves from the Church of England, embraced the Cambridge platform as a model that supported religious liberty. But that wasn't what the Puritans in Massachusetts had in mind. They saw themselves as visible saints, an elect identifiable by their conversion experiences, with the authority to compel magistrates to keep their society and church pure. Citizenship, and therefore civil rights, depended on church membership. And only church members' children could be baptized. That proved their undoing. By the 1660s, Westminster Confession, I think, is 1645. The Cambridge Platform is 1648. So we're 12 years later, or 15 years later, in the 1660s. The baptized but unconverted children of the saints, that is, those who didn't have a conversion experience, but their parents got them baptized because they were church members. Got it? Okay. The baptized but unconverted children of the saints wanted their children baptized. But because they weren't converted, they couldn't be church members, so they couldn't get their children baptized. They were denied this because, they don't have a conversion experience to confess. So a thing was devised called the halfway covenant, which allowed those baptisms, but still denied church membership to any of these unconverted parents and any of their baptized but unconverted children. Are you following me so far? Yeah. Churches split over this. The First Great Awakening in the 1730s, 1740s was in part a reaction to it. In the end, instead of regarding the gathered church as composed of inerrant saints, the liberal congregations came to agree with the British independents that the gathered church was a place of religious liberty. In time, the notion of being saints was replaced by the idea that human nature is essentially good. And conversion was replaced by the idea of lifespan spiritual growth. And so the call to gather is more than the school bell bringing class to order, or the house lights dimming before the curtain goes up. It is a call to those who have chosen this faith community to be gathered and enter into this collective spiritual practice for our collective liberation. The next several elements, the prelude, the welcome, the chalice lighting, the affirmation of covenant, and the opening hymn, are all parts of an initial movement of the practice that I usually call settling in. Ritually, symbolically, the chalice lighting marks the transition from ordinary time to sacred time, so to speak. That's when we actually enter into our collective spiritual practice, even though we say we enter into the spirit of worship with our prelude. The prelude begins to establish the mood, and I think the welcome as a moment of hospitality to guests does likewise. But once we are settled in, the time altogether, as you experienced vividly this morning, gives the first statement or hint of the morning's theme. Again, this is thematic preaching. The opening hymn might also do that, but it serves equally for gathering and settling in. Singing together means breathing together, an experience of connection that puts the cap on gathering. The time altogether also brings the presence of our religious exploration ministry into the service. Now, the meditation portion of the service has several parts. Joys and concerns lets us share significant developments in our lives or silently set down a burden as we go deeper into our practice. Here, our caring ministry is present in the service, as you heard. Then we enter into contemplation with the spoken prayer. The prayer might be another thematic piece, or it might be a pastoral response to some event of the week in our congregation or in the world. In the silence after that prayer, we acknowledge our diversity of individual spiritual practices, offering a brief time for reflection or meditation or silent prayer as each person chooses. The meditation hymn, Spirit of Life, caps this portion in the same manner as the opening hymn caps the settling in portion. Then we come to the reading and the sermon. There are different kinds of sermons, of course. There are pastoral ones that aim to comfort. There are teaching sermons that aim to give insight. There are prophetic ones that aim to inspire conviction and action toward social justice. Some sermons are confessional, being reflections on personal experience, modeling the journey of lifespan religious growth. And some sermons are a mix of two or more of these. Here, this portion that we're in now, is where we go deepest into the morning's theme. The last portion of the order of service, from the offering to the benediction, I call the sending forth. We begin our transition back from sacred time to ordinary time with a ritual of generosity, a good value to stick by in ordinary time when we encounter so many pressures and demands. Remember, generosity is giving within your means. As a value, it is a way to hold your heart, a way of approaching a moment. There are moments when remembering to be kind is generous. when leaning into our best selves and values takes a little extra effort. You've known such moments, I feel sure. So the offering is about more than money. It's about how we move and are in the world and how we want to re-enter ordinary time. Also, on second Sundays, it's where our social justice ministry is present in our Sunday practice. I've mentioned that our religious education, caring, and social justice ministry show up at certain points in worship. Reverend Richard Gilbert, the minister for many years at the Unitarian Church in Rochester, New York, identified the 4 core ministries of a church as religious education, pastoral care, social justice, and worship. Our Sunday practice reminds us of all 4. The closing hymn, Extinguishing the Chalice, and benediction complete this sending forth. First to coffee, and then to the world. So that's a walk through the order of service with an eye to what this collective spiritual practice is aiming at and what we are making space for in this hour on Sunday morning. And when we train pulpit assistants, I like to do that walk through to orient those who will be helping to lead worship to what in general they are helping to lead. We'll be doing a refresher training for pulpit assistants sometime in the next couple months. If you serve as a pulpit assistant or would like to, this morning does not exempt you from the refresher service training. I haven't given away all our secrets this morning. So look for an announcement about that training and do plan to attend. Back in the temple in the Thai National Palace, with figures of Hindu gods all around us, the tour guide found a way to be generous. She acknowledged that any religion is a way of life and offers practices for daily living. That's a common thread, as common as the golden rule in faiths throughout the world. And it's also true that you don't need a God to have a religion. But what do you need? It's better to have something positive to say. This that we do here every Sunday is a collective spiritual practice that we gather and do for our collective liberation. We do it to be reminded of the values we want to live into and liberated from those we don't. We do it to be reminded of our best selves and liberated from our lesser selves. We do it to learn and grow. We do it because it equips us to go forth and make a positive difference in the world. The standard Unitarian Universalist line on worship is that it is a spiritual practice of shaping worth in our lives. And it does. And so we do. May it ever be so. Amen.
I invite our chalice lighter, Martha, back up to extinguish our chalice. Please join in saying our closing words, which are in the order of service. Go out into the world in peace, have courage, hold on to what is good, return to no person evil for evil, strengthen the faint-hearted, support the weak, help the suffering, honor all beings.
And in so doing, may you live into our collective liberation.